Larry Korb. Larry Korb is Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress. He was also a Senior Advisor to the Center for Defense Information and an Adjunct Professor at Georgetown University. Prior to that, he served as Director of National Security Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, also served as Director for the Center for Public Policy Education and a Senior Fellow of Foreign Policy Studies at the Brookings Institution. Larry, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity. I'm going to cover two things today. One, what criteria should we use before we employ military force, and then how much should we be spending on defense? Now, the most important thing a woman or man who's in the White House has to do as Commander-in-Chief is decide when to send Americans into battle. The first thing you need to ask is this a war of choice or is it a war of necessity? Have we exhausted all of our other options? In my prepared testimony, I point out how President Eisenhower resisted the calls of people to employ military force in Poland, Hungary, and Vietnam. So you, I think, have to keep that in mind. Now, once you make a decision to use military force, then you need to ask yourself a number of questions that were put, I think, most cogently by Colin Powell when we had the Colin Powell Doctrine. The first is, what is the purpose of it? Is it to overthrow a dictator? Is it to transform society? What force will be necessary to do that? Is it worth the cost of being able to do that? I don't have to remind this committee about how people told us how little the invasion of Iraq was going to cost. When you're going to do it, it should be multilateral if you can. A good textbook example is the first Gulf War, in which we got 250,000 troops from other nations as well as contributions. That war cost the U.S. taxpayer nothing because since we provided the forces, people that couldn't do it provided the money. You should try and find out if you can get international approval for the action. One of the big mistakes the Bush administration made is NATO offered to go into Afghanistan after the attacks of 9/11 because they declared that as an attack on the alliance, and we said, no, we can do it without you. Eventually, we did bring them in. Next thing is, how will you know when you've won? How will you know when you've accomplished? And then finally, what happens the day after you've achieved the objective? After you get involved, I think you need a couple of other things to keep in mind. One is if it doesn't work, and you can't guarantee every intervention will work, do not double down. One of the most interesting things I ever did in government was working for President Reagan. When it didn't work in Lebanon, we got out. And we called it strategic redeployment, but the fact of the matter is we realized we could not win that civil war. And then finally, if in fact you think it's necessary to get the American people involved, you ought to put on a war surtax, since we no longer have a draft. This is what we did toward the end in Vietnam. Now, very quickly, I'll go through what happened in Iraq, the cost, as I point out, high. Libya, the president said we didn't plan after. Now, in Syria, people are talking about a no-fly zone. Well, as General Dempsey said, that would cost $1 billion a month, and would involve putting up to 30,000 people in, as Secretary Kerry said. Let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Larry. Neera, you have a question?
I'll just be very quick. You talked about the American military's engagement in the world and criteria for action. The American military has been called to do different things. I wanted to get your assessments of the American military's involvement in fighting the Ebola virus. It's essentially the address of the Ebola virus, and the fact that it did not become worse is in large measure because of an innovative use of the American military. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, again, and I can remember from my own days, I spent 25 years in the Navy, we would do these humanitarian things, but these did not involve the use of force except for self-defense. We were going in to provide, as a military, whatever else you may think, has terrific logistics. and they can do these things. So yes, they are. But I do think it's important to keep in mind, and I mentioned it in my testimony, you've got to fund the other elements of national power adequately so you don't have the military doing everything.
Thank you. Wendy?
Larry, very good to see you. In use of the American military, in the way that we've been discussing it, Neera just talked about when you have a pandemic or you have problems. Our military is also used in disaster assistance a great deal. And you are someone who has also put in a lot of time thinking about our alliances and about the institutions. We all have heard from Mr. Trump that NATO is useless, that we should get rid of our alliance with Japan, we should move out all of our troops, we should change our posture completely in the world. And I wondered if you'd comment on that. It's not that we don't want people to increase their defense budgets, we do. It's not that we don't want people to pay their fair share, of course we do, and need to do everything we can to make that possible. But can you talk a little bit about the role that alliances and the role that institutions like NATO play in making these very tough decisions?
Yeah, it's important to keep in mind that the alliances we started after the end of World War II were to contain the Soviet Union, Soviet communist expansionism. But now we find that they can adjust to the threats that we have. For example, even as we speak, NATO is undertaking Operation Anaconda, in which they have thousands of troops deployed into Poland on an exercise to send a signal to Mr. Putin that if she'd be foolish enough to come into NATO, it means war. And there's no doubt about the fact that Europeans need to do more. And I think it's important, as our last 3 secretaries of defense have told them, that they need to do it. But on the other hand, we shouldn't downplay what they do accomplish, and I think that's important. I used to handle the base structure when I was there. It costs more if you bring those troops back here and have to build the facilities. Home in Japan or Germany with host nation support, is less expensive.
Thank you. Cornell, and then Warren, sorry.
Thank you very much. So very good to hear you. I just raised a question about the moral principles when it comes to American foreign policy. My question would be, in your view, was the American role in the overthrow of Gaddafi a violation of international law or a violation of natural law? And I would say the same thing about support of the military coup in Honduras. I'd say the same thing about Iraq. But what is the role, as you conceive it, of the moral dimension? I know there's practical dimensions, there are prudential dimensions, but what is the moral dimension? If we're talking about America, we're talking also about having some kind of moral character of American foreign policy.
Whatever else you may think about that was sanctioned by the UN and NATO. So that gave you the legal basis on which to do it. The real question is, as President Obama has admitted, okay, that was great, now what do we do? And that we didn't think through enough. And I think that's the important thing. But I do think it's very important with the moral aspect before you use force, particularly when it's not a war of necessity. And that's why you have to weigh the cost and benefits. That's how you get, when you look at the moral things. When I was young and I was in Vietnam and I got there and I said, what are we doing? I mean, I just couldn't believe. And then, of course, you look at the, Agent Orange and things like that, and even today, people are still suffering from that there and here.
Warren, we are running out of time, but a quick question, please.
Yeah, I just want to ask, thanks very much for testifying. The United States spends, I believe, more on defense spending than the next 9 countries combined. And wanted to see what if you believe that we can responsibly cut defense spending without harming our troops or our military families.
There's no doubt about the fact that you can do that. And by the way, it's the next 7 now, because the Chinese have stepped up their military expenditures, 5 of whom are our allies. So yes, we can. The Department of Defense does not have a resource problem. If you look and you put it in constant dollars, the President Obama spent more than President Bush and more than we spent on average in the Cold War. So yes, they have a management problem. They need to be able to do things. As I mentioned in my testimony, $500 billion in cost overruns on your weapon systems. one of the things we just did, I tell my boss here, $1 trillion modernization program for nuclear weapons, you don't need to do that. You know, I mean, there are things that that you can do to stay within those numbers without impacting military families. And it's important to keep in mind, because there are things that you need to do to the military compensation system and all that. But that's not the veterans. They're a different budget, as you're going to hear. So every time I get and I talk, you know, about this, no, the veterans are taken care of separately. So no, you can do these things, and it needs to be better managed. I'll tell you, whoever becomes president needs to make sure that they get a strong deputy secretary of defense. Everybody knows who the secretary is. The deputy, somebody like David Packard or Charlie Duncan from Coca-Cola that Carter put in. That's when it's run well.
Thank you very much.